Okay, gewaltig. So yesterday we learned about Reb Shimon's halacha that you could use animals for Keit HaMizbeach, meaning we have animals that are surplus. There's four animals right before Rosh Chodesh season that are surplus. What do you do with those? So the first shita that we had, not according to Reb Shimon, was that you could just be putting on the chulin because of lev bez and mas naleim. But Reb Shimon doesn't subscribe to lev bez and mas naleim. Reb Shimon held that you could just use them for Keit HaMizbeach. You don't have to be putting them at all. And since he has that shita that you can use it for a similar type of carbon, like we had in our Mishnah, even though the individual carbonis, the Seirim of Yom Kippur, and the Seirim of Rosh Chodesh, and the Seirim of Yom Tovim and for Golem, even though they're not for the exact same purpose, exact same chait, nevertheless, they're good enough that they could stand in for one another. So this is what we ended off with. El Rabbi Yochanan the Gemara Gomer La L'Div Rab Shimon a Niftin L'Recham Niftin Rab Shimon the last lay Levezn Masna Leim Ma Abdin Lu. What do you do with these surplus animals? Omer Rabbi Yitzchak Omer Rabbi Yochanan Ma Kitzin Behenes HaMizbeach. You use them as extra oilers, and Gemara is going to tell us soon that Kate is Meloshin like a sweet dessert. It's to give the Mizbeach extra karbonis. And we learned Rashi, which we'll probably learn again, because that's going to be the springboard into today's sugya. Akitzin benes mizbeach, kisha mizbeach bottle. If the mizbeach has a slow news day, so there's no karbonis being brought, or there's extra time slots to bring more karbonis. Makriven oisa oila lenidvas tzibur. These four karbonis that were supposed to be used for the carbon tummy, we will use them just for oilos nedava. And we're going to soon see. Yesterday, I questioned as to whether or not these are also limited to the same year that the shkolim are from, but we're going to soon see, either today or tomorrow, that these can be used even later, even though the shkolim are not from the same year, because they're not like the prescribed karbanis sibur. Like we heard Reb Shimon said elsewhere in our Mishnah, Mishum Taima Duchulan Boyim Lechaper Al Tumus Mikdash V'Kadoshev. They're all servicing the general same type of classification of Avera. Alma Avalgav, the Lav Hainu, Tahi Kapar Gufa. Even though it's not the identical kapara, it's only similar in that same category. Tumus Mikdash V'Kadoshev, given the Shaicha B'Miktsasa Karvla. Since it has some similarity, it's in the general classification of this type of avera, you can use it. Hachanami, elu shalokchu l'tzorech tamidin. These animals that were originally designated to be used for a carbon tummy, and they became surplus. Yikruvu l'keit hamizbeach. You can use them for keit hamizbeach. It's not the carbon tummy, but it's still a carbon oila. Shorei l'shem oila hafreshu, because the carbon tummy was a carbon oila. The keit nami oila, and this keit hamizbeach is also a carbon oila. Lukamon mefarish mahu loshen kate, where the word kate comes from, and it's like a sweet dessert. So Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, getting back into the Gemara, umoider Rab Shimon would be agreeable b'seirei chatos she'ein makitzon begufon elo b'demein. The seirei chatos, what did we say? They'll be used for Yom Tovim. They'll be used for Rosh Chodesh, but you cannot use them for an oila. So let's have a look at Rashi. Moider Rab Shimon b'sirei chatosh sheniknu mitrumas alishka shalshanazu. So the trumas alishka bought some communal karbonis that had to be brought, such as the seir for Yom Kippur. But for some reason it became surplus. Or could go and seir shal Rosh Chodesh Adar sha'avad v'nimsa b'nisan. What if the seir that was designated to be brought to Rosh Chodesh Adar got lost? And when did we find it? We found it next month, and this in which now this was purchased from the old lishka, so you can't use it for a communal carbon from the new lishka of post Nisan. It will go l'keita mizbeach. So this is where Rashi says black and white that keita mizbeach doesn't have to be within the same year. It's only the official chayvos of tzibur that have to be brought from that year's shkolim. So in such a case, if it was originally going to be a chatos, you can't use it for a keita mizbeach of an oila moidahu she'ein makitzin begufoy likarafu oila. You can't do that. Ela b'damav, you would have to sell this carbon and then buy with the proceeds, buy an oil. So you can't just sell it. It's sheyira. You have to allow these karbonos chatas of tzibur, like the seirim of Rosh Chodesh. You have to let them pasture and graze until they get a mum. And when they end up getting a mum, eventually, yichu b'dam of oila, then with the proceeds you can buy an oila, l'keita mizbeach. Now, our default understanding would be based on the path that Rashi set us on in the last Rashi, where Rashi says it has to be from the same category. These seirim didn't start off as an oila. You can't just bring them as an oila. But we're going to see it's not quite like that. Really, even though it started off as a chatos, you would just the same be able to use it for an oila. Again, it didn't start off as a chatos. They bought it, and it was there in inventory. They intended that it was going to be used for the seir. So really, you would be able to bring it for an oila. The reason why you can't is for the reason that we're about to learn. Hachahu, if we're talking about the carbon tamid, where you don't have to sell it, you can use it directly for keita mizbeach. The mikara oila, the hashta oila, it was originally intended to be brought as the carbon tamid, which was going to be a carbon oila, and the keita mizbeach is also an oila. So you don't need to sell it. You can just use the same animal. Abul Hassan, but the seirim, let's say a seir of Rosh Chodesh, as Rashi used as an example, to make kar chatas, its original destiny was to be brought as a carbon chatas, but now you want to use it for keita mizbeach, which would make it into an oila, ba'ashta oila, not because there's a structural issue that you can't do that. You could do that. The problem is only a gzeira d'Rabbanan. It's gzeira la'achar kapara atu l'fnei kapara. After we already brought the carbon that this animal was designated for, and now this carbon became surplus, me'ikar adin, there's no issue whatsoever in using it as an oila itself directly. The problem is, if we allow you to do that, then you might also decide to take an animal that's designated to be, let's say, a seir of Rosh Chodesh, and even before the seir of Rosh Chodesh is brought, you could decide, no, I don't want to use this anymore for the seir of Rosh Chodesh. I'll use this for an oila. That you can't do. You could only do this, transfer carbon from one purpose to another, or to keita mizbeach, if it was surplus. If it wasn't surplus, you're not allowed to do that. So therefore, if we allow you to take a chatas and make it into an oila, even though it's after kapara, we're afraid you'll do that before kapara as well. Let's see Rashi inside. Hasam who gabe tmidim shalahutzruhu ka'amar Rab Shimon the Mekitzin begufan, there where you had some surplus kabbalas tamid, where Rab Shimon said you can directly bring them as an oila of keita mizbeach, the meikar l'shem oila nilkachu. Originally they were purchased to service as a carbon oila, v'ashanami lo l'krevi, and they're still being used as a carbon oila. Aval hacha, but when you're repurposing a chatos and you're making it into an oila because it became surplus, gzeira la'achar kapara atu kodim kapara. Imach sheres chatos tzibor likariv oila la'achar sheniskapu tzibor ba'achar. If you're going to actually allow us to just repurpose this carbon that was supposed to be a chatos and then became surplus, and you could just directly bring it as a carbon oila, and you can bring this same animal directly as a carbon oila, you'll have a problem. Because nami la'oila kodim kapara. You have an animal that's supposed to be brought as a chatas, you want to use it for one of the seirim, or the seir of Rosh Chodesh, and while it's supposed to be a chatas, there you cannot just willy-nilly take it away and make it into an oila. You're only allowed to do that if it becomes surplus. So therefore, in order that people shouldn't be confused and think that you could just make a chatas willy-nilly into an oila, we don't allow that to be done even when it's surplus, and therefore we require that it should graze, get a mum, redeemed, and then use the money to buy a carbon item. So from Rashi yesterday, the Rashi we started with, it seemed like it was you can't repurpose a chatas to an oil. Now we're seeing that any surplus carbon can be repurposed as an oil. The only reason why we wouldn't allow it is because of a gzeira that you might repurpose a chatas to an oil even when it's not surplus. Amar Abaye, Afana Nami Tanina. We also learned a brisa that supports this distinction. As Rashi says, Afana Nami Tanina, L'Rab Shimon, the In Makitzin, the Gufei Chatoy Sheni Toisru, Va'av Shemakitzin B'Dmeim. So this concept that when you're going from a chatos to Ketzah Mizbeach, to an oila, you can't directly use that animal for it. Rather, you have to sell the animal and use the proceeds to buy another animal. Because we learned as follows: Por v'soyer shel yom purim she'avdu. Imagine one of the karbonos that was designated to be brought in Kippur, it got lost. So the hifrish achayim tachteim. So because of that, we have to get substitute animals for them, or v'chein seiri avodah, which are any day of the year by a par hel bavishal tzibur, where Bezdin Paskin wrongfully that there's a certain avodah that was allowed to be done, a certain avodah was allowed to be done, and there were machshel klarishol to do avodah. So they also bring there a sir avodah, a sir lechatos, which is also the zrika is on the mizbeach apnimi. So avdoi that it got lost, and again the hifrish chayim tachteim, and there was a substitute carbon brought for it, and then we found them. What do you do with all these animals? Kulon yamusu, they all have to die. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. We learned that at the top of Yud Aleph from the base, this same brayso. They all die because it's like chatos shenischapru by leha, and it's one of the chomesh chatois where there's a halacha l'Moshe Messinai that we leave them to die. We do not redeem them. That was the words of Rabbi Yehuda. I remember year achi yistavu, because they hold that the halacha l'Moshe Messinai was stated only for a carbon chatas yochid that became redundant. It's yamusu. But if it's a chatas tzibur like the par at Sir of Yom Kippur and Sir of Avodah, there the halacha Moshe Mashiach does not apply, and we treat it like a regular carbon, and therefore you're allowed to graze until it gets a moment, then you can redeem it. The machru, the yiplu, the meim l'nedava, and the money will go to nedava. She'ein chatas tzibur mesa, because a chatas tzibur does not have this halacha Moshe Mashiach that it should die. For Freit the Gemara, if you hold, you can just repurpose something. The Ketam is Beach, V'amai, Nikrvu, Inu Gufayu, Oila. Use these same animals that once you found them, they're surplus because the chatos aren't relevant anymore. The karbonos were already brought, so now just directly repurpose them and use them as an oila. But that's not what Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shimon said. They said Yirat Shistavu, and then V'yimachru, V'yiplu D'meim L'Nedavu. You see the same idea. If we allow you to repurpose these carbonos that were going to be brought as a chatas, either on Yom Kippur or a Sir Avodah Zarah, if you allow them to be repurposed, these same animals, someone might repurpose them even when they're not surplus, and that wouldn't be allowed. So we've illustrated this same concept that there's a gzeir derabanan not to allow a chatos to be repurposed as an oila, rather it's yimachu v'yirat yistov v'yimachu. And we have many more cases that the Gemara cites that also illustrate the same point. Amarava afanana mitanina. We also learned a brisa that shows the same thing. V'asheni yirat yistov. The other one will be yirat yistov. Who is the sheni? So Rashi tells us what happened. B'meseches Yuma. We know that they're a pair. So what happens if it's Meis HaMishtalech? The Sir Lazazel died before they had a chance to do the avodah with it. And because of that, it disqualifies the Sir Lashem as well, because both of these pairs, their kashrus hinges upon each other. And therefore, they now have to bring two new seirim to have a new pair to make a goyel with, and then one will go Hashem, and one will go Azazel. The Yishtaleach Echad, one of them will be sent to Azazel. The Nimtzu Shnaim Lashem. Now we have two animals that are Lashem. We have the one from the first girl that's still good, and we have now the one from the second girl. So what do you do with these two Sir Lashems? Echad Mizuk Rishon, Echad Mizuk Sheni. So what do we do with it? Echad Yikrav L'Sir Nasa B'fnim. One of them will be the Sir Lashem. Hasheni, that surplus, Yira, let it get a mum, V'yiplu Damav L'Nadava, and we'll bring with it an Oilas Nadava, She'ein Chatas Tzibur Mesa. We don't just say that it dies, like a Chatas of a Yachid, because these Tanoim hold that the Halacha L'Moshe B'Sinai does not apply to a Chatas Tzibur. So now we have a surplus animal, and it's Yirat Shizdavu. So Rashi fears ois. Uman Shamaslei, the Omer Ein Chatas Tzibur Mesa. Who is the Tana that says a Chatas Tzibur does not just left to die if it becomes surplus? That Tana is Reb Shimon, our Reb Shimon. Because Amar, and Reb Shimon said in this Mishnah Yira, he said that you can't use this animal directly for Ketzah Mizbeach. Rather, you have to allow it to get a mum. The animal itself. The Chol Yiplu L'Nedava, the Kamer Reb Shimon, whenever the Shimon uses a word, the wording in the Mishnah, Yiplu L'Nedava, that doesn't mean it itself is brought as Nedava. It always means that you sold the original animal, and with the money you buy an oila. The Chol Dukta L'Ketzah Mizbeach. It always refers to Ketzah Mizbeach. That's what Yiplu L'Nedava means. It's Ketzah Mizbeach. But it says very specifically that this Ketzah Mizbeach isn't directly repurposing the extra animal. It's by waiting till it gets a mum so that you could sell it and you could buy another animal. And we have another ayah from another place. What if someone had a carbon osham that was prepared and the bilam died? Now, by an osham, you don't say that it dies like a chatois and mesos. So this osham now is surplus and it could be repurposed. So osham shemesu bilam. So you have a surplus carbon osham. Ocean is chapru bilam, or it's bilam got a kapar from a different animal because maybe you got lost and then they replaced it with a different animal and now they found it. What do you do with this surplus osham? Yira achi yistoiv. You let it get a moment. V'yimachar v'yiplu damav l'nedava. Rabbi Eliezer Emer Yamos, because Rabbi Eliezer, we're going to soon see, holds that osham is just like a chatos, just like a chatos that's a surplus is mace, so to an osham, so you don't need to do anything with it at all. And Rabbi Shua Emer Yavi b'damav oila. You'll bring an oila. So right away we need to understand what is the difference between Rabbi Yeshua that said Yavi b'damav oila and between Reb Shimon, the first shita, who holds Yir Achi Yistoy v'yemacher v'yiplu damav l'nedava. It seems to be saying exactly the same thing. We'll get to that in a moment. But let's focus for a moment on the Yir Achi Yistoy v'yemacher v'yiplu damav l'nedava. V'likrav hagufa oila. Why do you have to let it get a moment? Take this osham that's now surplus and bring it as an oila. You don't do that. Why not? So this is already the third raya, and the Gemara is not satisfied. The Gemara is still going to bring a fourth raya. Okay, and we also have to find out what is Rabbi Shua saying any different than the Chachamim. So Rashi tells us that there's a very big difference. The first sheet of the Chachamim, Yira Achi Yistoy v'yimachar v'yiplu damav l'nedava, that's talking about what the Beis HaMikdash does. The communal Beis HaMikdash takes this animal and brings it as a communal nedava. Rabbi Yeshua, on the other hand, says, Yavi b'damav oila, it's the owner's responsibility. Whoever owns this animal, they have to bring a oilas nedava of a yachid. What's the difference if it's a communal oila or if it's an oilas nedava of a yachid? Zok Rashi, very simple. Bisman sheibad nidvas yachid, soymech halah. First of all, the owner does smicha. V'shoichda, the owner can shecht it. Unesacha craving mishaloi. We all know that every carbon that's brought needs to be accompanied by nesachim. Who's paying for those nesachim? If it's a personal carbon, the owner will have to pay for those nesachim. But it was manchi ba nitvas tzibor eino yisoymachala. There's no din smicha. Unisacheh craving mishal tzibor, and the communal pot pays for the nisach. So that's the difference. Rabbi Shua holds it's considered an oilas yachid, and the Tanakama holds it's considered a carbon of the rabbin. But regardless, you see the same gzera of la'ach kabar atul kapara. You never change a carbon from echatas to an oila, even though technically you could. You don't do it because we're afraid if you do it, then you might repurpose a carbon even when it's not surplus. Shemamino. We have a fourth makor to this halacha, that you don't directly use the chatas for an oila, rather you let it get a mum, you sell it, and then you use its money. Mahein mevin min hamosaris. So Rashi says we're talking about the extra carbonis that they had at the end of the year, which is the halacha that we started this whole sugi with, right? You have 4 extra animals that are in the lishka that were going to be used as a carbon tamid, but now the year Rosh Chodesh Nisan came, you don't need them anymore. So what do you do with these extra animals? Zok the Gemara on Yud Beis Amid Beis. Kayitz, you use them as kayitz, which is this extra oila. Kivenois shuach lemizbeach. Is it shuach or suach? The shin, okay. Kivenois shuach lemizbeach. Venois shuach, Rashi says, are dessert items. To adam shemevi bikinuch suda mine misika. We usually eat sweets for dessert. V'uloshin kayitz kidichsiv halechem v'kayitz lechol mulnar. So basically, it's nice sweetened things. So you bring them as sweets for the mizbeach. Frankly, why don't you bring them as sweets for the mizbeach? That's not really a good description to describe a carbon, because sweets are actually outlawed from being placed on the mizbeach. So the mizbeach never indulges in sweets. So it's not really a good reference to use. So Tani Rav Chanina, Kivnoi Shuach LaAdam, you bring the carbonis kates as a dessert, just as you would serve sweets to a person. So once again, I don't yet see how we've proven that we're talking about selling it. So I'm mistaken because I didn't look at Rashi at the bottom of Yud Beis Amud Aleph. The Tanya Namahachi was not to the same point that you don't use the actual animal. Rather, Yirachi is toif, because we didn't prove that. It's Kido Amr Leil, Moish Rosh Lerb Shimon, Makitzin Ben Asimizbech. We're just bringing another reference to the halacha that we quoted earlier, that according to Reb Shimon, you would actually use them as a carbon. Okay, Gevaltik. So it actually we're actually no longer talking about that achatos is not directly repurposed for another. We're going back to the base halacha that we started with, that according to Reb Shimon, who holds that you don't say lev bez masnalem, you can use these actual behemoths as karbanos. Zok Gemara Vach. Darish Reb Nachman bar Reb Chisda. Ein makitzin ba'oila sa'if. What you would never do is use an oila sa'if as ketzim mizbech. That never happens. We're talking about ketzim mizbech buying animals, never an oila sa'if. Amar Rava, hi burcha. This is nonsense. Rashi touches burcha's dover habadim in alei. It's something you just made up. How could you possibly know that there's some prohibition against using these animals for oilas hoy? Amalei Reb Nachman bar Yitzchak l'Rava, my burchasa. This is not a joke. This is not nonsense. It's very serious, legitimate information. I'm the one who told this to Reb Nachman bar Reb Chisda, and I didn't make it up. I got it from a very reliable source. I told it to him because I heard it from Rab Simi min Harda. You know Rab Simi min Harda? You know why? There's no such thing as an oilas ha'oif that's ever brought communally. Every oilas ha'oif that you ever find in the Torah is a personal carbon. So you can't possibly use these excess tmidin and liquidate them and make them into an oilas oif, because the tzibur never brings an oilas oif. So it makes perfect sense. The Af Shmuel Sovar Lahad Rabbi Yochanan. And Shmuel also holds of this halacha of Rabbi Yochanan, going back to the Amar La'il to meet him, Shalahutzruchu, L'Rab Shimon, the last day of Masna, Makita Ben Mizbeach, Bugufan, Ben Srichin Re'iyah. Shmuel also holds like Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said earlier that according to Rab Shimon, the carbon tamid gets directly repurposed as an oil of Ketzim Mizbeach, because it's not a chatos to an oil, it's an oil to an oil, right? That's what we started with today, where Rabbi Yochanan said that according to Rab Shimon, you could repurpose these carbonis to meet them directly themselves as an oil of Ketzim Mizbeach. Where do you find Shmuel holds like that? The Omer Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Karbonos Sibur Sakin Moishchason L'Mashahem. The knife, the shchita, automatically pulls them to default to the same type of karbonos that they were originally. As Rashi says, Sakin Moishchason L'Mashahem, Sakin HaShoichdan, the sakin that shechs them, stam, even without identifying what they're for, Moishchasam L'Karbon Shahufresh Mitchila L'Kach. The stam shchita automatically designates them as the karbonos that they were originally designated as. Even though it's not, for instance, it's surplus. It can't come up more because we're done with the tamid. So it would be so if it can no longer be a carbon tamid, when you shecht it, automatically it's considered an oila. You don't have to specifically say I'm using this as an oila, because automatically when you shecht it, it defaults to an oila. We learned another brayta that supports this. Umayde Rab Shimon, the seir, which is the seir of Yom Tov, Shimloi Karav Regel. If for some reason you didn't use it on the regel, it became surplus. That Yikarev B'Rosh Chodesh, you could use it on Rosh Chodesh. V'mloi Karav B'Rosh Chodesh, Yikarev B'Yom Kippurim. V'mloi Karav B'Yom Kippurim, Yikarev B'Regel. V'mloi Karav B'Regel Zeh, Yikarev B'Regel Acher. Why? Reb Shimon said in our Mishnah, since this carbon, all of these three carbonos, the Shirish Chodesh and the Sir Golem and the Sir of Yom Kippur, they're all supposed to be brought on the Mizbech HaChitzain, and therefore they can all substitute for each other. Let's see Rashi. Moed Shimon umaskana the taima shemitchiloso leba ela lechaper al Mizbech HaChitzain. The maskana that the Mishnah Firzois, the reason for Rab Shimon is this common thread. Shemitchiloso leba ela lechaper al Mizbech HaChitzain. Alma, you see from that theme, Ahohu the Kabdina. That is the main hakpada. Sheyikarev al Mizbeach HaChitzain lechaper miktas davar shehuktash loy. It has some connection to what its original designation was. Chatas the tumas mikdash tikarev l'tumas mikdash. A chatas that was originally going to be mechaper on some type of aver of tumah in relation to the base of mikdash. That's what we're using it for. Even though it's not the identical violation, but it's in the same category. So too, what we said a moment ago, that the sakin moishchason means by default the carbon will remain the same type of carbon that it was originally designated for. Okay, so that takes us to the end of the sugya, and now we're weiter in the Mishnah, where the Mishnah says ve'al zodain Tumas Mikdash v'Kadoshav Sira Nasa B'Fnim is going to be mechaper. So let's have a look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah is listing off all these different karbonos that are brought on Yom Kippur. Which of theirs do they deal with? So it says over here, V'al Zoda and Tumas Mikdash v'Kadoshav Sira Nasa B'Fnim v'Yoyim HaKippurim mechaper. So it's a combined effort of the Sira Nasa B'Fnim, which we said is primarily focused on Yesh Lo Yedi B'Tchila Ve'en Lo Yedi B'Soif, right? It's Toila until you find out that you went into the base of Mikdash Tomei, but it also works for Mezid together with the Koyach of Yom Kippur. Zok to Gemara. How do we know this? The Tana Rabbanan, the Chiber ala Kodesh, mitumois b'nei Yisrael, umipishayem l'chol chatois. Umipishayem is amazing. Now we use that to teach us that it's referring to a shaygig that you don't bring a carbon for because you didn't yet know that you were tummy when you went into the Beis Hamikdash. But we're also darshaning is pshoyim elu hameritim. Those are the b'mezid. So when it says it's clearly listing off an aver of mezid. How do I know that the word pshia means mezid? You see it from Melech Moav Pashabi, where the Melech Yisrael came over to the Melech David and said that Melech Moav Pashabi, he's betraying me, he's rebelling against me. Please join me in a war. That's the pasuk in Malachim that the Gemara quotes from. V'aymer, another source that Pasha is a lashon of rebel. It says Oz Tifsha Livna be'esahi. The city of Livna also was rebelling at that time. So you see the lashon Tifsha is a lashon of merit. So therefore, when it says it's even including an aveir of mason. Chatois, what are chatois? What are the chatois? Eloshkagos, those are the aveirs that are done b'shogig. Where do you see chatois min shogig? Nefesh kisechta b'shkaga. So the word pasha is used to describe mazid, and the word chet is used to describe an aveir of shogig. Al shar aveirs shabbatayr. This is going to get into a very interesting sugya. So let's go back to the Mishnah to see the Mishnah inside. Al shar aveiros shabbatayr. On the rest of the verse in the Torah, hakalois v'chamuros, the not so severe and the more severe. We're going to explain now what this refers to. It says doinos v'shkagos. We know what those are. Hoida v'loy hoida, whether you knew about them or not. Asay v'loy saseh, whether they're an asay or a loy saseh, whether they're krisos and Mrs. Bezdin. Se'ira mishtalech mechaper. Se'ira mishtalech is mechaper. It's like a catch-all carbon mechaper for everything. Zok to Gemara. What does it mean? Kalois chamuros doinos shkagos. Asay loy saseh. Hainu kalois. Hainu asay. V'loy saseh. The definition of a very kala will be either violating an assay or violating a loisaseh. What would be considered an aver chamura? A chamura is hainu krisis or Mrs. Bezdin. Yet it already lists off assay and loisaseh. So why does it have to say again kalas and chamuras? It's redundant. The same thing with haida or loy haida. Haida means I know about it. I'm aware and I'm doing that very anyway. Hainu mezid. Loy haida, I didn't know about it. Hainu shoygit. So it already says bein mezid bein shogig. It says as a doinos v'shkagos. So why is the Mishnah repeating categories that are really redundant? Shogig is mentioned twice. One shogig, one loy haida. Mezid is mentioned twice. Mezid and haida. Kalois are mentioned twice because it says kalois. It also says asay and loisaseh. And chamuras are mentioned twice because it says chamuras and then it says chayv krisis. Amar b'do hachikam. This is how we need to understand the Mishnah. Al shar aver shabbatayr. On the rest of the verse in the Torah, bein kalois, bein chamurais, bein sha'asan b'shogig, bein sha'asan b'mezid, oisan sha'asan b'shogig, and those that you did b'shogig, bein noideloi sveikon, say if you knew that you came to a sofek avera. For instance, you find out that you ate a piece of meat and you don't know if it was chaylev or shuman, bein loy noideloi sveikon, or if you were totally oblivious and you never even knew that you had this chiyuv. The Elohein kalois, what are kalois? Asay v'loisaseh. So in fact, when the Mishnah lists up asay v'loisaseh, it's not creating a new category. It's just explaining what the Mishnah meant by kalois. Kalois are asay v'loisaseh, bein chamuris are krisos u'mishas best. So let's go back a second to bein noida loy sveikon bein loy noida. So bein noida loy sveikon does not mean mezid noida loy, which is what the Gemara's original kasha was. Rather, it means it's a suffix, and the question here is, do you bring an asham tolim? Because we know that if someone eats a piece of meat and he's not sure if it was chaylev or shuman, he has to bring a korban asham. So say if he knew before Yom Kippur that he had to bring a korban asham, the Sir Lazazah will pater him, and say if he never even knew, and he only found out after Yom Kippur that he would have had to have brought a korban asham talui, the Azazel takes care of it. So let's see Rashi. Ben shenoidloi sveikon shenoidloi sheba lidei sofik chaylev. He knew that he was chayiv in Hoshim Tali, or ben shenoidloi because he never even knew that she'achal sofik chaylev. Nevertheless, you don't have to bring a Nashim Tali. Yom Kippur, the Sir Lazazel, does whatever a Nashim Tali would do. If you were chayiv in Nashim Tali and you didn't bring it, and Yom Kippur passed, you no longer have to bring an Asham Toli because Yom Kippur accomplished what the Asham Toli would have otherwise accomplished. The Yalef Lo Hasam Mikra. Okay, so now that we have the understanding of how to read the Mishnah, now let's drill down a little. Break the Gemara. Chaya say one of the things that the Sir Lazazel is mechaber for is somebody who is over in a mitzvah to say. Hey, let's think about this. Either you were over a mitzvah to say, and you didn't do tshuva. So you're bemazed being murdered in the Rabbeinu Shalom. Well, for that, a carbon should work. It says Zevach Rishayim Te'eva. The carbon of a Rasha is repulsive to the Rabbeinu Shalom. So as Rashi says, V'heichim Chaperlei, carbon Yom Kippurim. The carbon couldn't possibly work. And either of a tshuva, and if it's a mitzvah to say that you violated and you're over tshuva, you don't need Yom Kippur anymore. Kol Yom Anami. Instantly you get a kapara. The Tanya over al mitzvahs say v'yasa tshuva loizos misham machamaychom loy. They're moichel you on the spot. So how would it ever be relevant that you need a carbon on Yom Kippur to be mechaper on a mitzvah to say mimanasha? If you did tshuva, you don't need Yom Kippur, and if you didn't do tshuva, Yom Kippur wouldn't help. So tomorrow Amar Bzeira Zokar Bzeira huge chiddush. But Oimid b'merdai Yom Kippur works even if you didn't do tshuva. Not according to everybody, to machlokes tanaim, but for Rebbe, the Tanya Rebbe Omer al kol aver shebetayra, bein asa tshuva, bein loy asa tshuva, yoim hakipurim mechaper. Rashi says, Omer b'mer do ava tshuva, ayu the kashalach zavach v'shoim te'eva. Zakimor masnis and Rebbe, the Omer yom hakipurim mechaper, even al she'ein non shavim. Yes, that's referring to any other day of the year. If you bring a carbon and you didn't do tshuva, it won't work. But Yom Kippur is machaper and every avera except for 3 averas. There's only 3 averas that Yom Kippur will not be machaper for without tshuva. Chutz mipayrek oil, which Rashi says is a koifer baker. Megal upon b'Torah, Rashi says is what we learned in Sanhedrin. What Menashe used to do, he would make fun of the Torah. Why did the Torah need to say this? Why did the Torah need to say that? So let's be mavaz of the Torah. And umefer bris bebasar, someone who tries to make himself look like he's not mol, he tries to reverse his bris milah. All these 3 averis, shim asa tshuva, yom kippur mechaper. If you did tshuva, then and only then will Yom Kippur be mechaper for these 3 averis. But vimlav, but if you don't do tshuva on one of these 3 averis, ein yom kippur mechaper. Frank the Gemara, my time with the Rebbe. What is this far? Where did the Rebbe get this from? That Yom Kippur could be mechaper someone even though they didn't do tshuva. Tanya. Oh, I'm sorry. My time with the Rebbe that these averis are so severe that even Yom Kippur is not mechaper. So this takes us back to my favorite pasuk. The Tanya Kidvach Hashem Bozo. We're talking about someone who is being over of a desire, I believe. The Torah says Kidvar Hashem Bozo. So we darshan, what does Dvar Hashem Bozo mean? That Zeh HaPorik oil Umegal upon the Torah. Because both those things are being mavasa Dvar Hashem. As Rashi says, Shabiza Dibur Rishon, Shel Omar B'Sinai Anoich Hashem Alakecha. Someone who is a Napikoris is being mavasa the word of Hashem, the very first commandment. So that's why there's no kapar for that. And the second thing is a megal upon him, be the afka krabaloshim bezoyin, the zeh boiza divrei Torah. Just Dvar Shem Bozo, being mavaza Dvar Torah, is exactly what megal upon him in Torah is. Ves mitzvasai hefar, what's that referring to? Which the Torah says about a tuni karis tikaris. Zeh hamefer bris bebasa. Mitzvasai hefar is referring to somebody who tries to reverse, who reverses his milah. Rashi she mitzvah yechidus. It's a special mitzvah. And what is the punishment? Hikares tikares. Hikares lefnei Yom Kippurim and tikares la'achar Yom Kippurim. So you have a pasuk that's directly addressing these three aveiros, stating that Yom Kippur will not be mechaper for these three aveiros. Zok Gemara yochel afilu also tshuva. You would have thought, even if you did tshuva, it says hikares tikares. Hamud loymar avoyna bo. Loy amarti ela bizman shavoyna bo. This pasuk that says that there's no kapara, that's only if avoyna bo, he's still holding on to his aveira. But if he's not holding on to his aveira, there and only there do we say there will Hashem will be much. Okay, Gavalta. Let's see Rashi. Lo yamarti el bizman shavoyna bo. Alma, you see from here, you see the pasuk is speaking that there's no kapara, karis to karis, only if there's no tshuva, only if it's still avoynable. Uvahanach tlas hu de galilon. It's only these three aveiros that the Torah tells us af la'acha yom kippurim. The Yom Kippur will not be mechaper unless there's a tshuva. Habishar mashma that by other aveiros, all the other aveiros, aval pi she'enei shav yom kippur mechaper. So this is the key word. How does Rebbe know that Yom Kippurim is mechaper even if there's no tshuva? Because the Torah went out of its way to tell you about three specific averos. That Yom Kippur will not be mechaper. Without tshuva, vice versa, that only applies to these three averos, but all other averos, Yom Kippur will be mechaper even if there was no tshuva. Frank Gemara for Rabbanon. The Rabbanon holds that Yom Kippur is not mechaper for any avera without tshuva. He doesn't learn the Ikaros means before Yom Kippur and the Ikaros means after Yom Kippur, because regardless, Yom Kippur is not mechaper if there's no tshuva on any aver. Rather, he learns that for these three averos that the Torah is referring to, Perek Oil, Magal Aponim, and Mitzvah Hefar, is Ikaros Boilam Hazeh, Ikaros Loilam Haba. That's teaching us that a person who engages in one of these three averos doesn't even have a chelik Loilam Haba, but that's also limited. Avoyna ba. If you're oimid b'merdoi, but shemasa tshuva umeis. If someone did tshuva and then he dies, misa mimarekes, and he would have oilam haba. Let's see for Rabbanan the islunami b'shar averos the inya mekor mechaper al she'enan shavin. The Rabbanan hold that no averos will Yom Kippur work for if tshuva wasn't done. Amar lach, they'll tell you how the galilon kra b'hanach tlas lav Yom Kippur mari. The Hikaros to Karos isn't telling you that Yom Kippurim is not mechaper, because Yom Kippurim is not mechaper in any aver without tshuva. Ella Hikaros to Karos, the Kamar is the Karos Leilam Haba. She'af Misa Eina Mimarekes al Sholosh Halalu B'Loi Tshuva. Misa will not take away this aver, will not clean out this aver without tshuva. Aval Shar Averis B'Loi Tshuva Nami Misa Mimarekes Achar Yom Kippurim. Other averis Misa will clean up completely. Aval Yom Kippurim B'Loi Misa will not. So Yom Kippur will not take care of an aver that you didn't do tshuva. But even if you didn't do tshuva, Yom Kippurim with Misa will take care of a regular aver. Okay, let's stop here. I just want to point out Tikaris. This pasuk the Gemara discussed a lot in Sanhedrin when we were discussing those people who don't have a chelik b'alim haba. And Tikaris is one of the main limudim, which is the Rabbanu learns, is where you learn that there's no chelik b'alim haba for these averos. Okay, we'll stop here.